The war on Iran has shaken the world and seemingly taken Britain by surprise. There are people on both the left and the right who think Britain should not even be involved or verbally supporting America and Israel. Meanwhile, in Britain, we are seeing people protesting in support of the brutal Islamic regime, including the deputy leader of the Green Party, which has just won a victory in Gorton and Denton by-election. I'm Connie Shaw, this is GB News Originals, and my guest is Dr. Einat Wilf, former Knesset member and one of the authors of The War of Return, and in my view, one of the clearest voices on the Israel and Gaza conflict, and someone the West must be listening to if we want to save our civilization. So, Einat, I wanted to speak to you obviously because of the ongoing war in Iran at the moment, and it's completely shaken the world up, not least in Britain. The left are saying that this is an attack on a sovereign nation and that the US and Israel just love starting wars. And the right is saying that Britain should not have anything to do with this, and obviously to a large extent we don't, due to the need to put Britain first and not to contribute to more migration from the Middle East. How would you speak to both of those sides to argue that this is in fact in the interest of Britain to topple the Islamic regime, and if not to get involved, but to at least verbally support what Israel and America is doing?
So I can't speak to the interests of Britain, but I can definitely say that from the Israeli perspective, and certainly from the American one, if you have a government that has mobilized entire resources of their country to the ideology of death to America, death to Israel, they should be taken at their word. If there's one thing that we've learned, and I've been arguing this for a while, we actually need to take the ideology of our enemies seriously. When they say that this is their intention, when they are mobilizing for it, when they are creating the means to execute their ideology, we should take them at their word. And we should not wait, as we so disastrously did on October 7th, we should not wait for our enemies to build the means and to actually invade and attack based on their ideology. I think it's much smarter to preempt it and to prevent them from having the means of doing so. Now, specifically, the Islamic Republic is not just any sovereign country, and that's what makes it unique. It is both a country, that's true, but it is also an ideology and a revolution that claims universal jurisdiction, whether it is the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, whether it is cells around the world. This is a government, a regime that made it clear that their country is not just a country, it is actually the basis for what they believe should be a global revolution. And that's where it is in the interests of other countries to ensure that this is not something that they can execute and carry out. So I do think that it is in the interest of many other countries. But if Britain can't see it, then fine, as Israel is doing it. And I have to say, one of the odd things here in Israel is that we need to kind of readjust our sense of ourselves as being the new Britain, in the sense of we are now the partner of the United States, the ones that have the military capability and, even more important, the will to actually go to war and do what is necessary to go against enemies with a terrible ideology. And I think this kind of changing of the guard between a declining Britain that wants nothing to do with it and an ascendant Israel that basically has the ability, the means, and the will to be a serious partner to the United States is something that even we in Israel need to begin to readjust how we think about ourselves.
Now, of course, in Britain, the IRGC is very active, and we've had at least 20 terrorist attacks which our security services have managed to foil. So in my mind, it's very clear that in order to stop the IRGC here, we need to make sure that they do not have any base, and that means toppling the regime. And it's extraordinary to me that particularly the right in Britain don't understand that, or, I haven't heard any arguments that have convinced me that this isn't in Britain's interest. What is the perception of Britain to Israelis about the way that we are so incompetent and so incapable of being involved in these sorts of things, because I'm of the view that we shouldn't be involved because we literally cannot. We don't have the capability. But I was so ashamed that our Prime Minister could not only agree with the Americans and say that he supports them, but when he gave his first statement, he didn't even say the word Israel. He couldn't even mention them. What is the perception from Israelis about the way that Britain has been throughout the last 2 years?
So if anything, and you said it, the perception is one that looks at Britain right now as a kind of cautionary tale as to what happens to a once great country that essentially loses the will and as a result loses the capability to fight for its values. As I'm sure you know, a lot of the running jokes are talking about the Islamic Republic of Britain, that as the Islamic Republic of Iran will come down, we now have actually the danger of a nuclear-armed Islamic Republic of Britain. There is a sense that British leaders are being cowards. Not all. We're seeing some very interesting and inspiring opposition leaders not going in that direction. But the current leadership in Britain is one that quite a few Israelis are looking at and saying, really? That's what you've come to? This kind of cowardice to stand for your values, for who you are, has the sense of kind of feeling so ashamed of who you are. Has it eaten at you to the point that you no longer understand how important the values are, how much it's worth protecting, what your country stands or at least used to stand for? So I think in Israel, there is, as I said, there's this sense of almost the changing of the guard, as Israel being that junior partner of the transatlantic alliance that is willing to stand up for values, that is willing to fight for them, that has the will, that is willing to make the necessary sacrifices to actually fight enemies with a terrible ideology, which is historically what Britain inspired worldwide.
And you just touched on their ideologies that we should fight against. Could you explain the Islamic regime's ideology to our viewers? Because I think, in Britain, we have a prime minister who still seems convinced that this was a regime that was capable of negotiating towards giving up its nuclear capabilities. I think there's a huge misunderstanding. I know that you talk about this a lot, about Islamism, in particular, the Iranian regime's type of Islamism, and this word eschatological, and what that means, and what you think that they want to do, because I think there's such a huge misunderstanding, and that's what's contributing to this reluctance from both the left and the right to really confront it.
There's a beautiful piece in the Free Press by Jonathan Rosen about the world that the fatwa made. And it's a great piece because it really shows you that the Islamic Republic had a global vision. So there's a tendency to think of it, okay, as a sovereign country, and we are in a world of sovereign countries, and you need to protect sovereignty. But the Islamic Republic had no notion that it embraces a world of sovereign nations where the sovereignty of nations is protected. Clearly, the sovereignty of Israel was nothing that the Islamic Republic thought worth protecting or defending. The same for America. And as you said, the same for Britain. The Islamic Republic had a global vision by which its vision of the end of days of an Islamic Republic is not limited to the sovereign state or nation of Iran, but is a global vision. And therefore, if a fatwa is issued, it goes global. There are no borders. There is no local judiciaries. The only laws that matter are the laws that the supreme leader gives to Muslims around the world. So the notion of a world without limits, without borders, where the leaders of the Islamic Republic can issue fatwas, can issue directives to Muslims around the world, and even expect, and as we saw in the case of Salman Rushdie, to expect Muslims to carry out those ideas. This is the thing that people need to be aware of. And what I find amazing, again, is the tendency to not take ideologies seriously. And I think this is something that especially people in the secular West have invented a word for it in the Palestinian context called West-plaining, when Western diplomats and academics and journalists explain away uncomfortable truth about the ideology of our enemies, even though they very clearly say it, again, not least death to America, death to Israel. But there's a tendency to write it off. They can't really mean it. And what I've come to appreciate is don't think about your perspective. Think about their perspective. They mean it. They take it seriously. They do live in a world where the Islamic Republic is the beginning of a global revolution. And in that sense, I compare on the positive side, the fall of the Islamic Republic will be as dramatic as the fall of the Soviet Union in terms of bringing down an ideology that sought to bring down the West, that worked very heavily at exporting itself, both militarily, financially, and most important, ideologically. But right now, it's a nation that's been hijacked by an ideology for the purpose of its global export. And again, we might think it's ridiculous, but it is much smarter to understand that they don't think it's ridiculous, and they're operating on that assumption.
And what does the word eschatological mean when we're describing somewhere like Iran?
It means that their vision of the end of days, which is clearly an Islamic vision, and in their case, a Shiite Islamic vision. What's important to say is that they're not passive about it. You know, people can think about in the West, especially if they're Christian, that they also have a vision of end of days. The question is, do you think of yourself as, on your country, as being in the business of bringing about the end of days? And the problem with the Islamic Republic is that it's not a passive vision that kind of says, yeah, one day, their version of the Messiah, the hidden Imam, will come back. It's not this kind of version of passively we pray for it or we hope for it. It is a vision that says it is incumbent upon us to take actions to bring about the end of days. And clearly, Western civilization, Christianity, they are enemies of this vision of the particular Shiite Islamic end of days theology.
There's nothing more important than keeping your money and your identity safe online. And with so many VPN options available, choosing the right one can be pretty daunting. But this video's sponsor, ExpressVPN, is making the choice easier for GB News viewers. ExpressVPN is offering up to 75% off, plus 4 extra months free. That's top-level security from just £2.49 a month, and you're covered by their 30-day money-back guarantee. So just click the link in this video's description or scan the QR code now. Remember, when you're online, you are often sharing personal data, so hackers can steal your information, your passwords, your photos, and your bank details in just seconds. But ExpressVPN encrypts your connection, making it virtually impossible for hackers to access your personal information. So why choose ExpressVPN? Well, it couldn't be easier to use. With just one click, you are protected. And ExpressVPN uses military-grade AES 256 encryption, which is the same standard trusted by the US government to guard their classified information. With their new tiered plans, you can protect up to 14 devices at once and manage passwords securely. Live chat support is available 24/7, and it typically connects you in under a minute with a real person. Click the link in this video's description or scan the QR code to get up to 75% off ExpressVPN, plus 4 months extra for free. Start protecting yourself today with ExpressVPN.
What is the difference between Iran's eschatological vision and, if anything, Israel's eschatological vision?
Oh, Israel has none. Israel, really, fundamentally, we would love to be left alone. The only problem is that we are not being left alone, so we find ourselves constantly having to fight. Uh, if anything, the problem is that the Jewish people, and especially now kind of whitewashed with the notion of Zionism in Israel, uh, play a key role in the end of days vision of other people. That's the problem, that for a lot of societies, including the secularized, now what we call the woke left, um, getting rid of the collective Jew, now called Zionist, is key to their vision of getting to utopia. We saw it after October 7th when people held placards that said, keep the world clean, using environmental language with the sign of the Star of David or the flag of Israel in a trash bin. And this is merely the modernization, secularization of one of the most ancient ideas that exists in, unfortunately, a few civilizations, that the collective Jew stands between this messy world and utopia. In this case, for some people, a human rights utopia, an environmental utopia. But the notion that the collective Jew stands between this world and utopia is fundamental to quite a few systems, even those that think of themselves as secular, such as the woke left, and do not understand the extent to which they are carrying out a secularized end of days ideology that believes in a utopia that stands on the other side of getting rid of the collective Jew. I will say that the Jewish vision of kind of the end of days peace is one that, even actually is a quote outside the building of the United Nations in New York, the vision of, I don't know in English, Yeshayahu? I know, but that is the vision of, that people, that the swords will be plowshares and that people will no longer have war. So there is certainly a Jewish vision of peace that I think ultimately was taken by other cultures and civilizations. But there is never a notion that it is incumbent upon the Jews to bring it about. It is understood that at one point it might happen. And again, there is nothing wrong with believing that somewhere the world is going to live in peace and the lion, will sit with the sheep, or the wolf will sit together with the sheep. There is a problem when your vision is that it is incumbent upon you, often by violent means, to bring it about. But fundamentally, if Israel could have one thing, one wish given, is seriously, if we could just be left alone.
How does what's happening in the West Bank line up, and arguably some would say what's still happening in Gaza or attacking Hezbollah and Lebanon? How does that add up to the idea that Israel just wants to be left alone?
Oh, quite simply, when I discuss in other contexts the history of the conflict, especially with the Arab world and as their spearhead, the Palestinian Arabs, I always like to bring the quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, when he goes to the British Parliament in February 47. And in February 47, it's really important to note, there is no West Bank. It's before Jordan occupies it. There are no settlements. There's no Israel for that matter. No Arabs or Jews have been displaced as a result of war. And when he goes to the British Parliament to explain the British failure, and I would say betrayal, of the terms of the mandate, which it was given unanimously by the League of Nations to help the Jews realize the universal principle of self-determination in their homeland, he explains that Britain failed because His Majesty's government is faced with an irreconcilable conflict. And he didn't invent it. He listened to the side. The Arabs, to their credit, were speaking very clearly. I would say they still do. It's just that many Westerners engage in West-plaining. And he says, for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. So really, the Jews just want to have their own sovereign state, even if very small. And the Arabs, he says, these are the Arabs that will later take the name Palestine. He says those Arabs, their top priority is to resist to the last. The word resistance, you still hear it, resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. So by definition, it's an irreconcilable conflict because one side, the Jews, really just want to build their own state in even part of the historic land of Israel on lands reclaimed from malaria and desert. And the Arabs in the land make it their top priority not to build something for themselves, something that we saw going all the way up to Gaza and the West Bank. They've made it their priority to ensure that the Jews have nothing. And this is why, again and again, when Israelis elected with large majorities prime ministers throughout the 90s and the early 2000s who would try to make peace with the Palestinian Arabs to establish one more Arab state on the lands of the Ottoman Empire, every time that the Palestine Arabs were presented with a choice, and it's been the same choice for a century, you can have one more Arab state, right, in addition to Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, which were all created from the Ottoman lands. He says there can be one more Arab state in the land, but it will have to live next to a Jewish state. And every single time, first century, the Arabs with different leaders, different permutations, basically say, no, it's more important for us to ensure that the Jews have nothing than that we have something. And again, this is the question of an ideology. At what point do you stop westplaining your enemy? At what point do you stop making excuses? And at what point do you basically demand that the ideology of your enemy be finally defeated? And this is the problem we have in the West Bank as in Gaza. Despite repeated multiple times that the Arabs got the opportunity to control their fate in those territories, people forget that Gaza used to have an airport and a port, and on the eve of the massacres of the Second Intifada, they effectively had all the elements of sovereignty in a state. It was more important for them to go to a wave of massacres and war to ensure that the Jews have nothing rather than build something for themselves. So Israel has attempted multiple times to basically ask the Arabs, leave us alone. Just, we're happy to even have a smaller Jewish state on barely any of the historical land of Israel, but let that be the end of it. But it's not, because in their vision, and we can discuss why for so many Arabs and Muslims, the idea of erasing a Jewish state is so central to their identity. But if they were only to finally decide to build for themselves rather than destroy what the Jews have built, they will find, as has been in the last century, that the Jews, other than our desire for a sovereign state somewhere in our ancestral homeland, are not the problem. I always like to say that for the last century, the Jews have agreed to any two-state solution, provided one of the two is the Jewish state. And the Arabs, especially the Palestine Arabs, have rejected every two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. And that's the issue. Never has been anything else.
You've spoken a lot about the idea of Arab Zionism, and in the West, and for some Israelis, from my understanding, Prime Minister Netanyahu is seen as quite extreme to some people, especially people my age in the UK. But I understand that you considered Israel's response to October 7th to be quite lacking. Why is that?
Oh, because I compare Israel willing to basically agree to this comfortable lie, but it's still a lie, that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, and to go to war only against Hamas and for the goal of disarming Hamas, my argument that this is a lie. I compare it to America declaring war on Japanese pilots after the attack on Pearl Harbor. No, that's not how it was done. There was war against Japan. Britain, when it was Britain, it went to war against Nazi Germany. It didn't go and try to find out just a few of the worst perpetrators. It was understood that this was an ideology that is based in a sovereign country, but that ultimately the ideology has to be defeated. And my argument is that after what they did on October 7th, taking one of the most beautiful territories in the world with fertile soil, with billions of aid from the world, the gullibility of Israelis who only wanted to be left alone and to believe genuinely that the Gazans were finally just minding their own business and taking care of themselves, they took all those assets. And rather than, again, true to this notion of resist to the last establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, true to this ethos of prioritizing and destroying what the Jews have built over building for themselves, they turned Gaza into a single integrated, weaponized territory that military experts have to go to ancient history to find parallels, to some island in the Philippines during World War II and the Pacific Campaign to find anything parallel. So my argument that after what they prepared for years, the investments, the invasion, the massacre, after that, Israel had to make it very clear that this is not a war against the executive arm of this ideology, which is what Hamas is, right? The M in the Hamas name, Mukawama, means resistance. Again, resist to the last. So rather than go to war against the most recent executive arm of this ideology, Israel had to make it clear that this time it is the ideology that has to be defeated, like that of Nazi Germany, like that of the racial supremacy of Imperial Japan. The problem is the ideology. Again, the same for the Islamic Republic now. And the ideology has to be defeated, and that we had to fight for that. And in many ways, when you go to war based on a comforting lie, then you can't win. And we see that Hamas is still in power in Gaza. Palestinianism remains a dominant ideology. And all the elements that support Palestinianism, UNRWA, perpetual refugeehood, return, all of those elements are still in place. And yes, therefore, my criticism was that we went to a very limited and therefore the completely wrong kind of war.
And what would your strategy have been? Because when people hear you say we need to destroy Palestinianism, I mean, that's going to make the hair on the back of their neck raise. Does that mean, does that mean genocide? That's what people will be thinking when they hear that.
Okay, so a few lessons in logic. When you say that the ideology must go away, whether it's Nazism or racial supremacy or, the Soviet ideology, it's not the people, it's the ideology. And that's the thing. Some people are really, I think, fail to take logic lessons. When Britain went to war against Nazi Germany for the defeat of Nazism in Germany, it was not about killing all Germans, but it was definitely about making it clear that as long as this is the ideology of Germany, as long as Nazism is the ideology of Germany, it will be war until they surrender and begin the very important process that I think today we all recognize was valuable and important, that the transformation of the people away from that ideology has been good for the world. A Germany and Japan that are pillars of world peace did not come out of nowhere. It came out of making it very clear that their ideologies were wrong and brought their country ruin and had to be defeated. And, sometimes people treat the conflict as if it's like just some cycle of violence of savages. But if you think about it, it's incredibly logical. Whenever the Arabs, and especially the Palestine Arabs, go to a war of annihilation, and there's never been any other kind, and again, by their telling, by their declaration, if you remove West Planning, if you give them the credit and the respect of taking them at their word, every war that the Arabs, especially the Palestine Arabs, have waged against the Jewish state was always declared to be a war of annihilation. And every time they failed, rather than getting the message that Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan got, which is your ideology that prioritizes destroying what the Jews have built over building for yourselves, is a terrible ideology. It's brought nothing but ruin and devastation to the world and to this region, and you have to let it go. Rather than getting that message, which, by the way, so many people, it wasn't just Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. Everyone that collaborated with them, that helped them, got that message. They had to pay reparations, and they had to pay with territory, and people were displaced. And yet all of these things, which were tough, created a world of peace because they sent a message that said, enough is enough. And rather than getting that message, the Palestine Arabs, every time they get the message that say, no, 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 you didn't lose. And there's a great book about Japan post-World War II called Embracing Defeat, which is a great phrase. It really shows that embracing defeat is often the beginning of real growth and transformation when you draw a line on the terrible ideas that brought you to ruin. It's true for personal as well as collective lives. So rather than the Palestine Arabs getting the message, enough is enough, insofar that your ideology was about prioritizing the destruction of the Jewish state over building for yourselves, you lost. Accept it. Draw a line. And now begin to be what I've come to call Arab Zionists, which perhaps sounds a bit provocative, but it merely means that you can be a proud Arab, you can be a proud Muslim, and recognize that the Jews are not foreigners in the land of Israel, that they are indigenous, that they have the right to self-determination, and that you as Arabs want to live next to a Jewish state rather than on its ruins. And we're beginning to see some of that in the Gulf states. And to be an Arab Zionist doesn't just mean that you're willing to live next to a Jewish state rather than devote yourself to its destruction. It also means that in terms of your spirit, you're forward-looking, you're focused on building. Because if you look in the last century, a bit less, anti-Zionism has always been the mark of failed societies. Because it is the respectable Soviet-created replacement for Tsarist anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism is always the mark of failed societies, societies in crisis that are looking to scapegoat. And you can actually see that supporters of Palestinianism over the last century, from Nazi Germany to the Pan-Arabists to the Soviets, now the Ayatollahs, after much of the destruction they brought, always found themselves defeated in cold or hot wars and ultimately found their ideology in the dustbin of history. And it's no coincidence because, again, if you prioritize destroying others, if you enter into this rabbit hole of madness, of conspiracy theories, of thinking that the Jews are to blame and they're behind everything, you do what the Ayatollahs did. You take a wealthy country with many resources and you run it to the ground. So to be an Arab Zionist doesn't just mean that you live next to a Jewish state and embrace it and accept it. It means that you also let go of conspiracy theories, of scapegoating, of destructive ideologies, and you finally begin to build for yourself. And it's not a coincidence, by the way, that the Islamic Republic has put most of its attacks not on Israel, but on the United Arab Emirates. because, again, it's an ideological attack. The United Arab Emirates represents everything Islam can be when it is forward-looking, tolerant, part of the world, embraces women's rights. This is a very different vision for what Islam can be, for what the Arab world can be. They show that you could be a proud Muslim, a proud Arab, and not engage in end of days vision about destroying your neighbors in other countries. And this is why the Islamic Republic is attacking the UAE, because the UAE stands as the ideological alternative to their vision of what Islam should be. And that's what we need to understand that's going on here. And again, this is the Ayatollahs have made themselves the supporters of Palestinianism as the heirs to the Nazis, the Pan-Arabists, the Soviets, and they will finish in the same dustbin of history, because when you prioritize destruction, you ultimately destroy yourself.
On wanting to destroy Palestinianism, obviously, from the pictures that people see on the internet of Gaza, and Gaza is absolutely destroyed, yet the Palestinian ideology that you talk about still exists. And so is it even possible to destroy the ideology when you're fighting against an enemy who's not just prepared to kill, for example, like the Nazis were, to achieve their aims, but they are not just prepared, happy and seemingly want to die for the cause? How can you fight against that sort of enemy, and how is it even possible to defeat that ideology? Because I remember hearing Michael Oren saying that Hamas are in some ways an impossible enemy because they are prepared to not only sacrifice their own lives but also their children to defeat an ideology, when these are terrorists who are happy to die fighting, knowing that they're going to lose. And the same with Iran. They know that they're going to lose. And another question that I had sort of linked to this, and sorry, this is a bit long, is one of the reasons why Iran is attacking all of these other Gulf states who haven't attacked them. Is it not just because they're ideologically a different type of Islam, but because they want to bring about this Armageddon? Do they believe that will bring about this Islamic end of times? And so, yeah, how do you fight against an enemy who's happy to die, not just kill, but die themselves proudly for this cause? Will bring about Armageddon, so it happens.
So we tend to think of ideologies as divorced from what fuels them, but that is rarely the case. The amount of people who are willing to devote themselves even to most fanatical ideas in the absence of any support, legitimacy, funding is ultimately very, very small. Japan, on the eve of surrender, was described as a society mobilized for death, right? People were willing to literally commit suicide for that ideology. And yet somehow, it took 2 nuclear bombs. But again, it's not about killing all Japanese in terms of the numbers, the ratio of the population. It was a small share, but it was the overwhelming power and the will of America to use it that demonstrated that they had to surrender. So even when we think of ideologies as being fanatical, fundamentalist, suicidal, extreme, turns out that in the face of overwhelming power, there is this tendency to surrender. And again, I think this is the problem that we had with the Gazans, that it was stopped too early and there was no demand for surrender because, again, the war was defined badly. It was defined as, again, just against being Japanese pilots, only against Hamas, which is merely, again, the executive arm of the ideology of Palestinianism. And there was no demand for surrender. And I think there should have been a clear demand for surrender, nothing less, because like I said, this conflict is, rather than telling the Palestine Arabs that they lost, the tendency is to tell them your victory is merely delayed, try again, and billions flow in to trying again. So ideologies have things that fuel them. In the case of Palestinianism, it is UNRWA, which gives UN legitimacy, Western money, and institutional support to keeping alive, I would say in many ways, creating Palestinianism as a national ideology that says, keep working till there's no Jewish state, it will happen. So the continued funding to UNRWA is something that needs to go away. The organization needs to go away. The creation of multiple generation refugees, which is unlike anything that's been done after World War II, right? Tens of millions of people were displaced in the process of empires falling, new states being established, and they all got the message. It's tough, it's tragic, you move on. Again, the Palestine Arabs are the only ones that hijacked essentially an organization that was supposed to be to settle them in order to keep it alive, UNRWA, until their victory over the Jewish state. The only post-World War II refugees who did not get the message that said, tragic, enough, move on. So there's a lot of things that keep ideologies alive. And like any good general, you know, that they say that, the really smart generals don't talk strategy, they talk logistics. There's a lot of things that fuel the ideology of the enemy. UNRWA, perpetual refugeehood, the false idea that they have a right to settle in Israel, what they call the right of return, but there's no such thing in international law. Even Resolution 194 doesn't grant it. So all these ideas, if you begin to remove the funding, you begin to remove the legitimacy, you peel off the organizational capability, you will find that the number of fanatical devotees is much smaller. And the same with the Islamic Republic. You begin to end the funding, the support, the military capabilities, you isolate them, you make sure that they do not have support among other countries, then ultimately you will find, yes, there will still be a few fanatical true believers, but you will create the space for what we know are many, many, many other Iranians who have a very different vision for their country. So the notion that you cannot defeat ideologies is empirically false. Ideologies have been defeated time and again, but they were defeated, first of all, by having the will to defeat it, by understanding that you defeat them by removing their fuel, their support, their legitimacy, their funding, their infrastructure. And then you sideline the few insane true believers, but ultimately you create the space, whether it's for the Arabs of Gaza, Arabs in the West Bank, the Iranians in Iran, to come up with a different ideology that does not bring ruin to the region and the world.
And just to wrap up, Einat, in Britain, we've had recently a by-election where the Green Party won by a considerable amount. And it was very clear that their campaigning was directed towards the Muslim community and the constituency Gorton and Denton. They even campaigned in foreign languages, in Urdu and Arabic. And one of the accusations thrown back at people who raised concern about this sectarianism, because the campaign said in this foreign language, we need to punish the Labour Party for Gaza. People criticise those who criticize the sectarianism by saying, but these Muslims are voting for a gay Jewish man. How could they possibly be anti-Semitic? And secondly, the other shocking thing that has happened is the deputy leader of the Green Party, Mohsin Ali, he attended a pro-regime, pro-Ayatollah demonstration. They call it Stop the War, but there were posters of Khomeini's face saying, be on the right side of history. And when our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's the one who recognized a Palestinian state with Hamas still in power, and is the one who still thinks you can negotiate with Iran, he criticized the deputy leader for attending this march. And the response from the Green Party leader, the Jewish gay man, Zach Polanski, who people say all of these Muslims are voting for, so they can't possibly be anti-Semitic or sectarian. And he called the Prime Minister Islamophobic for criticizing the fact that the deputy leader of the Green Party attended. I mean, it's a mess. What would be your message to Britain? Because I'm terrified, and I think a lot of people are, about the way that this country is going.
So the answer actually lies in the Islamic Republic. What brought down the Shah and brought up the Islamic Republic was what was called the Red-Green Alliance. I'm sure your audience is familiar with that. The red being the Marxists, leftists, what some are called the woke left, together with the Islamists. Now, what they share is, in both cases, both the Marxists, the woke, and the Islamists, they share several elements that allow them to create a very powerful alliance because, especially with the Islamists, it creates the numbers that allow you to win elections. They both share the desire to destroy the current order, the belief in a utopia, and the notion that the collective Jew stands between this world and utopia. The fact that their visions of utopia could not be any more different is something that in many ways gets set aside in order to jointly engage in the project of destroying the current system. And this is what you had in Iran. The Red-Green Alliance brought down the Shah, so they were very effective in destroying an existing system. For that, the alliance is very powerful, and especially as it comes together on the idea of joint destruction and turning the gaze to the collective Jew. And it's important to say, Jews who sell out their people, they're very useful as covers for that, and they have been historically, but they change nothing in terms of the ideology that the collective Jew, at this point called Zionism, stands between this world and utopia. So the Red-Green Alliance was very effective in bringing down the system in Iran and bringing down the Shah. But as soon as the Islamists came to power, by the way, always promising democracy, human rights, they always speak that language, they immediately turned against the secular communists, killing them, butchering them. Many of them had to flee. They are now the very pro-Israel, pro-American, pro-Western, and anti-Islamic regime Iranian diaspora. And what you had is an Islamic totalitarian theocracy. So you are right to be terrified because it's a very effective alliance, has proven itself again and again. It literally is the alliance that corrupted the entire global and United Nations system. It's now working itself in the West with a lot of woke left, green, useful idiots. And ultimately, when the Islamists come to power, the environment that they create, and by the way, I think you're beginning to see it in some areas of Great Britain, the environment that they create when they are in power is not something that I think any Westerner really wants to live in.
Dr. Einat Wilf, thank you so much for joining us and for telling us and warning us what we should be aware of. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Connie Shaw, that was Dr. Einat Wilf, and this is GB News Originals. Please like and subscribe.